Hello, and welcome to this special edition video on Incoterms, documents and payment mechanisms. So let's start with what are Incoterms. Incoterms is an abbreviation that's broken down as International Commercial Terms. And they're a series of predefined commercial terms that have been published by the International Chamber of Commerce and are widely used. They define the responsibilities of the seller and the buyer for the delivery of goods under a contract, and they cover matters such as shipping, insurance, and tariffs. Now, the International Chamber of Commerce published the latest Incoterms that came into effect on the 1st of January 2020. They're refreshed every 10 years to reflect changes to global trade environments, but the first Incoterms were published back in 1936. So Incoterms are used to clarify business terms in international trade. The many benefits of Incoterms will outweigh any negatives for most transactions, which is why many trade agreements are facilitated using Incoterms. They're still preferred and preferences between the parties, and the terms themselves must be negotiated before an agreement is finalised. So the benefits of familiarising yourself with the Incoterms is going to help smooth the transactions by defining who's going to be responsible for what at each step of a company transaction. So if you're going to be involved in trading through global supply chains, it's really important that you clearly understand your obligations. Simply put, Incoterms are the seller's terms that the buyer and seller of goods must agree to. And the Incoterm you select clearly states which tasks, costs and risks are associated with the buyer and seller and where the seller's costs and risks are transferred to the buyer. So we start with the transfer of cost. This is the point at which the seller is no longer responsible for paying for the carriage. And that point forward, the buyer must foot the bill. That doesn't necessarily happen at the same time as the transfer of risk. We'll show you that later. But the transfer of risk is the point at where the risk regarding damages for loss is transferred from the seller to the buyer. So from that point forward, if the goods are damaged or lost, the seller is no longer responsible for replacing or repairing. Customs clearance responsibility sort of defines who's going to be responsible for clearance of customs, both imports and exports, because it will need to export from the country that it's leaving from and be imported into the country that's receiving them. And finally, insurance, whether insurance is mandatory and who will pay the premium. So at a high level, there are 4 groups. So each of the terms will either start with the letter E, F, C, or D. So with the E terms, the goods will need to be collected by the buyer from the seller's premises, and the buyer will bear all costs and responsibilities for the entire journey. So the seller only duty is to make the goods available at the door of their premises. It may assist with transit, but this is not a requirement, and there is only one E term, and that's Ex Works. If I go to the other end of this now, because the D is the complete opposite to the E, the D is the responsibility of the seller for everything, all the costs and responsibilities for the entire journey, all the way to the buyer's premises. So the E's is the buyer's responsibility, the D is the seller's responsibility. So they're liable for the damages and the losses in transit, the insurance, and so on. So that leaves us with the F's and the C's, where the responsibilities are transferred partway through the journey. And I say what separates the F's from the C's is the deep blue sea. Whether it goes via train, plane, boat, or road, it's going to cross international waters. But if your Incoterm starts with the letter F, the seller is only responsible to take it to the port of departure, so they only get it as far as the country where it's exporting from. Whereas with the C terms, the seller will have to get it across the sea as well. So that's why I say it separates them from the deep blue sea. So C terms are mainly used when the seller takes responsibility to get the cargo now to the port of arrival. Let's look at these in a little bit more detail. So ex works, a term used by any mode of transport. So that's road transport, air transport, that's railway and sea freight. So the transfer of risk is at the buyer's disposal, which means the buyer has to go and collect the goods. And the buyer is responsible for both the imports and the export clearance. And this is basically what it looks like. So you can see the dotted line at the point where the seller's costs stop and when the buyer's costs start. I always say, if you want to remember this, if you want it, come and get it. That's basically what the seller is saying to you. And the buyers are obviously responsible for both import and export clearance. So when you're contemplating your Incoterms, think about the right one for you. Some of the times the sellers imposes this on us and it's not necessarily the right thing to do. But it's just sometimes it's the only one that they'll work with us on. But there are so many consequences because the blue line at the bottom indicates all the additional costs you're going to have to calculate. And when when the Incoterms 2010 changed, they were actually considering removing this ex works rule, but eventually it remained. But it has been one of those ones that they've been trying to get rid of. So I'll go again to the other end of the spectrum. This is the Ds, where the seller is no longer just taking it to their back door. They're going to get it all the way to your premises as well. So the buyer can basically sit back and wait, and everything's included. So there are 3 Ds, all of which can be used by any mode of transport. But in the D group, the seller is responsible for both the imports and export clearance, unlike the E's where the buyer is responsible. And the most common one is the DDP, which stands for Delivered and Duty Paid, where the seller bears all costs to get the goods all the way to the buyer's premises and has the obligations to clear the goods not only for export, but also for import and pay all the duties and carry out all the custom formalities. DAP is delivered at a place, so sometimes it wouldn't necessarily be at your premises. It might be to a named place like a bonded warehouse or your customer premises, but the buyer is responsible for offloading. And then DPU was actually added in the 2020 version of Incoterms because there had been disputes around who was responsible for offloading. So DPU is delivered at a place, but the seller has to also offload and get the goods into the building as well. And as you can see here, that dotted line has moved all the way across the journey now. So the seller pays everything to get it to the buyer's premises. So if you want to remember it one way, I'd say remember it as signed, sealed and delivered. And there are 3 F terms. In Group F, the seller is responsible for export clearance, but the buyer is responsible for the import clearance. So you've got FAS and FOB. They're both used for sea freight and inland waterways only, whereas FCA can be used on any mode of transport. But FAS stands for free alongside ship, and FOB is free on board ship. So in effect, what happens is the seller takes the cargo to the ship and either leaves it on the quayside along the ship, or they'll get it craned onto the ship. When they get it craned onto the ship, they get something called a bill of lading, which is kind of useful later. We'll talk about that with the documents and payments a little bit later, but it's essentially a proof that they've fulfilled their obligations. With the FAS, the seller would need to leave it on the quay, and then the buyer would have to pay to get it craned onto the ship. But in both of those, as soon as it leaves the export port, the buyer is responsible for all the costs thereafter. Now, FCA is an odd one. This is called free carrier. The term can be used on any mode of transport, and the seller delivers the goods to the carrier or whatever's been nominated by the buyer. And at that point, the transfer of risk is on the buyer's transport. So the best way to explain this is, when you return something that you've bought online and they say, yep, it's okay to return it. Here's the label, pop it on the package and drop it off at the UPS or DPD port or whatever it might be. That's basically what the buyer is giving them. They're giving them a label. The seller will box it, label it, and drop it off at the nominated carrier. But ultimately, the the buyer is paying for it from that point onwards. And that's what it looks like now. So you can see the seller gets it to the port of departure, and then the buyer takes over from there. That leaves us with the C terms. There are 4 C terms. The top 2 are used on sea freight and inland waterways, whereas the bottom 2 are more used on road freight, I would say. So you've got CFR and CIP. CFR is cost and freight, but you'll notice that there's no insurance on that, which means the buyer would be responsible for the insurance. You've got CIF, which is the same, but the seller is responsible for the insurance. CPT, carriage paid to on any mode of transport. Most commonly it's used on road transport, I'd say. So it's carriage paid to, but no insurance. Whereas CIP is carriage and insurance paid to, where the seller is responsible for the insurance. Now, in Group C, the seller is responsible for the export clearance, but the buyer is responsible for the import clearance. So the only term you can use to make the seller responsible for import clearance is the D terms. And here you can see we're now at the port of arrival, where the costs change from the seller to the buyer. And here you can see it all together in one place. Who is responsible for what in terms of costs, risks, and insurance? And you can see it moves from left to right with a trend of obligations shifting from the seller in the orange to the buyer in the blue. Take a moment to look at the exclamation mark. This is showing you where the transfer of risk is, which is interesting in the C terms, because whilst they're responsible for the cost of carriage, the risk transfers when it's on board that mode of transport, which is usually the ship, but it could be in any mode of transport. So we're now going to look at some documents that are required to facilitate the flow of international goods, both imports and exports. If you imagine it to be a little bit like a person, people can't cross borders without having any passport documents with them or visas and things like that. And it's very similar. It's a very similar approach. So the first thing that helps is a purchase order. Obviously, you know, the purchase order is a request from the buyer to the supplier, providing deliverable lines that the supplier can submit an invoice against. That's kind of helpful because if they are stopped at the borders to say, why are you doing this? Why are you bringing that in? The purchase order can kind of prove that there's a contract in place. A bill of lading is a document that's used to sort of show that the goods have actually been loaded onto a ship. And it's a document of title that details what's required of those involved in transporting, carrying, and consigning goods until their point of delivery. So a bill of lading would be used on sea freight, whereas an airway bill, which is very similar, is for air freight. The insurance cover ensures the goods are being transported by the buyer, and supplier or both may be responsible for ensuring that any goods transported are covered by a suitable insurance policy. So it should cover the value of the goods and should detail how it's applied. Is it dates, locations, etc.? The buyer must be sure of their responsibilities relating to the chosen policy and should ensure that it's adequately covered at the correct stages of the journey. You've then got a pro forma invoice. So this is usually an estimate or a quote that's completed before the sale takes place, or a preliminary invoice, which with all the same details as a standard invoice, but it states the seller's intent to deliver the products to the buyer. It often requires the buyer to pay in full before the shipment is delivered. You've got your pack-in list or consignment notes. This is an itemized list of what's actually inside the container. It may include the handling instructions, and in international shipments, the pro forma invoice and the packing list are often combined as a single document. And a certificate of origin is a declaration that officially sort of specifies the origin of a particular delivery of goods, and it provides assurance for custom agency officials as well as the buyer that the goods have come from a particular country, allowing access to certain tariffs and duty reliefs. There are two types of certificates of origins. You've got the non-preferential certificate, where the goods do not qualify for any special treatment, or you've got a preferential certificate, which certifies that goods are eligible for reduced tariffs or exemptions. All of this is used by the Customs Office to determine the appropriate amount of tax or tariffs. And then a carnet is a document that allows the temporary free movement of goods for a specific purpose within a designated boundary or along a set route. So goods must not remain in the country permanently. Through the use of a carnet, the person responsible for the goods should ensure that all goods are accounted for and apply the custom regulations of the country that they enter. So when you're exporting goods around the world, there are different shipping methods to consider. It is going to depend on the overall product packaging size, the cubic measurements, or the total weight. But the most popular shipping containers are a 20-foot, 40-foot, or 40-foot high cube GP, which stands for general purpose. And the high cube is one that has an extra 10 to 15% of space inside. LCL cargo is less than a container load. And a break bulk cargo is the least popular and generally used for oversized cargoes that exceed the length, weight, or height of a 40-foot container. And containers can be dry, they can be refrigerated, open topped. And if you're doing it via air freight, you can use the ULD, which is the unit load device on the right-hand side. They're obviously specially designed for cargo pallets, and they're used to load freight and luggage and mail onto an aircraft, because you can see that odd shape on the side will help it to sort of sit very comfortably in the belly of an aircraft. So import duties and tariffs. Now, duties can be calculated in two ways. The first one is called ad valorem. Import duties are calculated on something called a landed value, so the value of the goods inclusive of any freight or insurance. And they get levied according to the integrated tariff of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland, which gives duty chargeable quotas and preferential rates. So the importer is responsible for making sure the correct UK tariff classification of the goods, and is legally responsible for this even if they've used an agent. Other times you can do it by weight or measure. So if, for instance, instead of it being as a percentage of value, you might have to pay a price per kilo or a price per meter or something like that. And then finally, there are various payment mechanisms that can be used in international trade. They carry different risks in relation to payment and delivery. And if you look at the diagram on the side, you'll see the exporter is the seller and the importer is the buyer. And some are more favourable to the buyer and some are more favourable to the seller. I guess in an ideal world, we would want it always to be on our terms, which is to have an open account where the supplier ensures the goods are delivered to the buyer and we make a payment, I don't know, 30 days afterwards, which is the sort of typical standard terms. So a great deal of domestic trade is obviously undertaken in that way, but when it becomes international trade, that could mean that the supplier is waiting a hell of a long time for their payment. So great and beneficial to us, but not great for the supplier, because there's a risk that they won't get paid, or they have to wait a long time to get paid. So an open account needs to be carefully managed to prevent cash flow problems for the supplier. The most secure for them would be a cash in advance payment. It's the least secure for us, but it's the most secure for the seller. So the buyer pays the seller for the goods before they're even received. So for the exporting supplier, this may pose risks to the buyer if the buyer doesn't receive delivery due to, I don't know, getting lost in transit, or you didn't dispatch it. And you may not be able to recover the money that you've paid to the supplier, who may not accept the responsibility of the loss. So what kind of balances these risks out where the buyer isn't getting the most secure for them and the seller's not getting the most secure for him either, is to find some kind of middle ground. And one of the most common ones is called a letter of credit. This is a guarantee provided by the buyer's bank to the supplier, stating that exporting supplier will be paid when the supplier meets the conditions that are detailed in that letter. So this option sort of supports the payment of a supplier, but is especially favourable to a buyer as they're not obliged to repay the bank until the terms of the letter are met with all the required documents provided. So that's where the bill of lading comes in. And then you've got other documentary collections, which are things like a site draft or a time or a term draft. So with a site draft, the supplier is paid for the goods as soon as they have received them, which means they've seen them on site. Whereas a time draft is where you essentially collect all of your documentation, and there's a delay that gives the buyer time to inspect the goods, but as soon as that time is up, the money gets released. So that's everything I had to say today for Incoterms, documents and payment mechanisms. I hope you've enjoyed the video. Please do let me know if there's any other topics you want me to cover. Thank you.